After the devastation it suffered in World War II, Poland was a struggling nation, and life didn't get any easier when it became a satellite state of the Soviet Union. But Poland has been clawing back its status as a major player in Europe, and some are saying it might even soon surpass the once mighty Great Britain as a major world power, both economically and militarily. That is a big claim. So let's examine Poland's rise to power and how it might just be turning into Europe's next superpower. If you went to Poland a few decades ago, around the time Coca-Cola was still regarded as something of a luxury item and a symbol of American capitalist imperialism, life might have looked a little grim. This was a country that had been torn apart in the war, hit from two sides by the Germans and the Soviets, and then faced decades of hardship under communist rule. In historical terms, Poland has certainly experienced some extreme ups and downs. As the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth in the early 17th century, Poland was a force to be reckoned with, able to defend itself against other powers and more than capable of its own aggressive actions against its neighbors. At its peak, the Commonwealth was home to 11 million people and had spread itself over 1 million square kilometers, compared to Poland today, which is 313,930 square kilometers. Much of Ukraine was under Polish rule for much of this period, which Russia fought it for. But the Commonwealth was easily a match for Russia. In fact, in the Polish-Muscovite War of 1605 to 1618, the Poland-Lithuanian Commonwealth made substantial territorial gains in the region on the European front, something Russia would never forget. This was the Polish Golden Age, though, a renaissance period for Poland. The country was a major political, military, and economic power, and while it never quite reached the heights of other great European powers or colonized other nations, its prowess allowed its culture and language to spread far and wide, a process known as Polonization. But then came the downfall, where Poland was in effect erased as a nation. Bit by bit, the country was taken apart in what we now call the Partitions of Poland. These occurred piecemeal in 1772, 1793, and 1795. Russia, Prussia, and Austria together picked Poland apart, and Poland wasn't militarily strong enough to stop those huge territorial seizures from happening, which had been weakened from its oligarchical rule. In just the first partition, Poland lost around half of its population, or around 1/3 or 81,500 square miles of its land. In the second, Russia and Prussia took another 115,000 square miles, and after those two countries quelled a Polish uprising in 1794, Poland lost another 83,000 square miles. Austria grabbed what was then known as Little Poland, an area southeast of the country that contained the city of Krakow. This was not a great time in Polish history. For 123 years, there was no autonomous state known as Poland. But then, under Napoleon Bonaparte, the Duchy of Warsaw was created in 1807 after Poles fought alongside him. This was a client state of France, but something close to Polish sovereignty. Then Napoleon later failed miserably in his invasion of Russia, after which European powers decided what to do with the borders and territories in the meetings known as the Congress of Vienna from 1814 to 1815. That saw the end of the Duchy of Warsaw, making it so Poland was once again firmly divided into parcels owned by Russia, Prussia, and Austria. The Congress Kingdom of Poland was created, but it was under Russian rule. Then in 1830, there was the November Uprising, in which the Russians eventually quelled a Polish rebellion, after which in 1832, the Russian Emperor Nicholas I issued the Organic Statute of the Kingdom of Poland. This was an attempt to erase any autonomy the Polish had in Russian-occupied Poland. Meanwhile, there was widespread persecution of Poles, sometimes referred to as anti-Polonism, which would last for centuries not only amongst the three partition countries, later from the Germans and the Ukrainian nationalists. All this hardship shaped how many Poles feel today about their nation, especially the more recent tough times Poland has faced. The country only regained its independence in 1918, but then just 2 decades later it was invaded from two sides at the beginning of the World War. After almost 6 million Poles died in the war, and then it became a client state of the Soviet Union. It's thought Poland lost around 38% of its national resources and infrastructure in the war, and while the Germans were supposed to pay back Poland in reparations, that did not happen, or at least not as it should have. The Soviets ensured reparations came from Soviet-controlled East Germany, so those reparations didn't exactly look like a windfall. Poland not only went without these large reparations from Germany, but it was also not part of the Marshall Plan, which was the U.S. initiative to help war-torn Western Europe. The communist years were marked by almost constant crises, often resulting in protests when the low standard of living was too much for many Poles to take. There were numerous reforms and there was constant repression, although many Poles saw the light at the end of the tunnel when in 1970 Edward Gierek became the first secretary of the Polish United Workers' Party. He promised to improve people's lives and partly opened Poland up to the West while allowing much more freedom of speech and expression than those that had come before him. For many, Gierek's era was the first time they owned luxury goods such as a car or a TV. He oversaw the construction of the now famous Polish town blocks. He built the first highway in the country while creating and strengthening other industries. He built steel works and glass works, and under him the automobile factory that produced the famous Polski Fiat 126P was constructed. Poland was still poor, but life did improve for many, and Gierek's relatively liberal attitude compared to the leaders that had preceded him was like breathing fresh air after living in a stuffy smokehouse for 2 decades. Alas, Gierek borrowed a lot of money from the West to fuel his plans, around $40 billion, which eventually brought an economic crisis to Poland. And by the end of his tenure in 1981, sights such as people queuing around the block for many hours just to buy a roll of toilet paper were a regular occurrence. People weren't just broke, many didn't even have food, and there was talks of uprisings. Poland's GDP per capita in 1979 had been $2,167, and in 1980, it was down to $1,595. Compare that to Britain, where the GDP capita was around $10,000. In the US, it was $12,000. France had similar numbers, while Spain was around $6,000. Portugal was $3,300 and Italy $8,000. Poland was poor, and it seemed like the country could never catch a break, something that might partly be driving Poland's rise to power now. Economic experts talk about how GDP doesn't always tell the full story of how well people live. And that's correct, but in 1981, Poland was indeed an economic tragedy. People struggled to buy the most basic necessities. The police were highly corrupt, as were most other officials, and the regular working person didn't have much hope. The Rzeczpospolita daily newspaper wrote that in the summer of 1981, Poland was at the bottom of the crisis, stating that Warsaw was so poor that the buses couldn't run because there wasn't enough money to replace tires. As food was rationed and people could buy just a few pounds of meat per month, citizens took to the streets flying banners that showed a black skull with a knife and fork crossed below. People shouted in unison, "We are tired of being hungry. We are tired of queuing. We demand life on the level of a civilized country." The New York Times wrote on July 30, 1981, that anger over food spreads in Poland, and that there was a new wave of unrest as people called out that they were hungry, they wanted bread, they wanted meat. They said they had enough of lies and threatened that the hungry will eat the authorities. The government responded by implementing martial law, blaming the food shortages on strikes. While not the response the protesters were looking for in some ways, it was a slight improvement, since in the decades earlier being part of a protest might have meant torture and a bullet in the back. So, this was Poland in 1981, a year before much of the world watched E.T. the Extraterrestrial, and saw how young American kids living among pretty tree-lined streets didn't seem to have much to worry about other than their next bicycle adventure through their beautiful suburbs. And in those kinds of films, when someone opened the refrigerator door, inside was more food than you could dream of. Poland was another world completely. Polish people wanted that reality, and now many of them have it. If you visit Poland today, while there is still poverty of course, the days of food shortages seem to Poles like another world. There's a collective breath of fresh air being breathed in, and this one is no flash in the pan like the late 70s when the government got so reckless with borrowing. The present seems like a new golden age to those that suffered through wars and communism. Meanwhile, news media in the UK is saying Poland will soon overtake the UK as a major European power. This is huge if it's true. We're talking about a country that had the biggest empire the world has ever seen being overtaken by a country that couldn't even feed its citizens just a few decades ago. And the UK's decline and Poland's rise serve as a comparison for each other, so we'll show you just how far Poland has come. As many Poles are now enjoying this relatively good patch in their history. Meanwhile, in the UK, between the 1st of April 2022 and the 31st of March 23, a leading UK charity said it distributed 3 million emergency food parcels, an increase of 37% from the same period the year before. In what's called the cost of living crisis, demand for food banks hit an all-time high in the UK. Sure, Poland has food banks too, but the difference is that most people that use them, according to the European Food Banks Association, are refugees. In the UK, it's the general populace that's now unable to feed themselves, sometimes even with a full-time job. Hundreds of thousands of Poles emigrated to the UK over the last 20 years, but now the British media is saying they're returning to their homeland in droves, a homeland now being called the Land of Opportunity. The Sunday Times said the standard of living in Poland is improving, while British standards are declining. The cost of living in the UK is increasing, as is the crime rate, and as are waiting lines at hospitals. Is this an exaggeration? A recent article we found titled "Traveling Across Poland Showed Me That Britain's Economy is Broken" described ugly and forlorn-looking former industrial towns in Britain full of betting shops, pawn shops, and discount supermarkets. In larger cities, he found people sleeping in doorways everywhere. He wrote, OECD using GDP per capita at purchasing power parity. Cities like Warsaw, Poznan, Krakow, and Wrocław are all wealthier than Liverpool, Birmingham, and Manchester. He said he found the differences in how much better life was in Polish cities immediately obvious. What happened to the seemingly unsinkable ship of Great Britain, and how did Poland manage to become so much stronger than it had been in the past? Poland initiated major economic reform in 1989 when it transitioned to a capitalist market economy. Small and medium state-owned companies were privatized, and the private business sector flourished as Poland was viewed by its neighbors as business-friendly. It began to receive a lot of foreign direct investment, or FDI, since it soon had a highly skilled workforce and was cheaper than much of Western Europe as a place to do business. The country soon became one of the world's so-called economic miracles. It was the growth champion of Europe, experiencing better growth than even those Asian tiger economies such as Taiwan, Singapore, and South Korea. Also, Poland managed to largely avoid recession in the global economic crisis of 2008 and 2009. As the GDP for the European Union as a whole decreased by 4.5%, the Polish GDP actually increased by 1.6% when the crisis was at its worst. One of the worst countries hit was Great Britain, which had for years banked on its, banking industry. It eventually became the G7's worst-ranked nation for business investment, quite the opposite of Poland, which focused on building brainpower and business development. This was a country that in 1990 had a GDP per capita of a paltry $1,731, which was minuscule when you consider Britain's was about $19,000. France at the time was about $21,000, and the US about $23,000. Spain was around $13,000 and Portugal was $7,000. Poland was still poor, but it was about to change those glaring GDP shortfalls. When Poland joined the European Union in May of 2004, its economy was subsequently turbocharged. And this wasn't the result of flogging all its natural resources or some kind of banking magic. The reason, as many economists have pointed out, is Poland's diversified economy, and more importantly, the brainpower of the public, which has embraced entrepreneurship. The government promoted competition while putting much emphasis on higher education. In 1989, only about 1 in 10 young Poles studied at the university level. Now it's 1 in 2, higher than the EU average. In a study published by the Program for International Student Assessment, or PISA, it revealed that Poland was one of the leading countries in the world regarding educational standard improvements. Poland's PISA score for reading, math, and science was one of the highest in the world at 12th place, behind countries such as China, Singapore, Korea, Japan, Switzerland, and the Netherlands. The UK was down to 26th place, but it was at least above Italy, Spain, and the US. PISA said Polish 15-year-olds are more functionally literate than most kids in the EU and North America. The country's also become an IT hub. The European Commission recently made a list of the strongest tech innovators in Europe, and Poland was placed in the emerging innovator bracket. The UK didn't even make the list. We're not trying to pick on the UK here, it's just the press has been talking a lot about how Poland will overtake the UK as a power, so we've chosen the UK as a comparison in which to judge Poland's ascension as a power. Poland is now said to be a leader in the Central and Eastern European region for greenfield investments, which are investments where a company starts a new venture by constructing new facilities from the ground up, rather than purchasing or leasing existing ones. Ranking as third best in Europe, its location between East and West Europe hasn't always worked out well for Poland, but now with its much improved transportation infrastructure, it's in the perfect place to bridge developed economies in Central and Eastern Europe. 94% of investors are reported to be willing to reinvest in Poland, in part because it offers smart investment incentives, and according to Statistica, it's the most attractive country in the region in which to invest. It's always a good sign for an economy when foreign countries want to invest there. the Swedish battery manufacturer Northvolt just opened Europe's largest factory for energy storage systems in Poland. In 2023, Microsoft said it was impressed with Poland's IT scene and opened its first data center there, calling Poland the newest trusted cloud region, and the data center the first in Central and Eastern Europe for Microsoft. Google has also opened a data hub in what it says is Poland's thriving IT industry. Poland is excelling in the area of aerospace, which is evident when you look at its so-called aviation valley in the southeast of the country. 115 companies are working there, which employ 23,000 technicians, engineers, and designers. Other large industries in Poland are agriculture, automotive, energy, defense, manufacturing, and tourism. Speaking of the latter, besides many cities with outstanding architecture, Poland also has vast wilderness to be explored. It's home to the Central Eastern Europe's largest number of areas on the UNESCO World Heritage List. Poland has been one of the best performers in terms of European tourism booms over the last decade. Poland's also described as a good place to live in general, and now often makes it onto lists of the best places to live in Europe, with people saying you get good bang for your buck in Poland. If you look at various lists of countries in Europe where expats and digital nomads are drawn to for low prices but high standards, Poland generally is featured on those lists, which means drawing talent from the global talent pool. Still, Poles earn less than Brits on average. The UK in 2023 had a per capita GDP of about $46,000, and Poland wasn't even half of that, at around $19,000. France's was $44,000, Italy $36,000, and Portugal at $26,000. Poland is still a bit behind, but nothing like it was in recent past when its GDP wasn't even a tenth of the UK's, and if trends are anything to go by, it'll overtake the UK's soon enough. We should add again, though, that you can't look solely at GDP and know what life is like for people in a nation. Ireland has a massive per capita GDP, double that of the UK, but only because huge multinational companies have operations there. A recent survey showed 7 out of 10 young Irish people wanted to move out of Ireland because they believed they'd find a better standard of living elsewhere. Wealth isn't spread out equally, which is why you have much of the UK currently relying on food banks, and millions of homeowners are finding themselves priced out of life after what AP in 2023 said were skyrocketing energy and food costs stemming from Russia's invasion of Ukraine. GDP per capita doesn't always mean a lot. People are saying life in Poland right now is better for your average Joe, or shall we say Joseph, than it is in Britain, despite the GDP difference. This is a country on the rise. To understand the standard of living, it's better to look at what you get for your money, what safety nets are provided for you, how well educated you are, and what chance you have of flourishing in the workplace. You can also look at forums to get perspectives from average citizens, and we did just that. One man said, "I'm 31, born and bred in the UK, and I've recently moved to Poland. The first thing you notice is that you get a lot more for your money in Poland." He talked about how safe he felt, how inspiring it was to see how proud people are to be Polish. He added, "Poland will afford you a much better quality of life with plenty of surplus to spare." Another poster said when comparing the two nations that in Poland you had safety, better food, better quality and better educated people, intelligent and beautiful women, great, amazing and rich culture, better social and interhuman styles, more polite and educated society on the main. One person wrote in Poland he found low cost of living versus a fantastically high standard of living. Great education, okay to decent food, great travel locations, friendly people, and lovely weather. We don't want to idealize Poland, and of course these forums are to some extent self-selecting, but we found literally 0 people who lived in both countries that didn't prefer Poland. This hope and pride the first person talked about, which is partly related to the tough time we explained that Poles have had, account for a lot when we're considering Poland's present and future development. The British are suffering a confidence crisis, a national disillusionment, and many people have lost hope in their governance. A recent survey revealed 73% of those living in the UK said they didn't trust the government to help improve their lives, whether on the right side or the left side. 56% of Poles said they distrusted their own government, but 55% said they trusted the EU. The economic analyst Matt Klein recently explained that things in the UK are worse than GDP per capita makes it seem. He said, "Take out Greater London, the prosperity of which depends to an uncomfortable degree on a willingness to provide services to oligarchs from the Middle East and the former Soviet Union, and the UK is one of the poorest countries in Western Europe. The same article explained that the UK has become a dark triad of deindustrialization, degrowth, and denigration of foreigners. Considering per capita growth and productivity growth per person, the UK is actually the worst in the G7 with its yearly decreases. But Poland's per capita growth has been increasing every year. That doesn't mean as Poland becomes a more mature economy, it'll stay that way, but right now the arrows are all facing up. The average growth in Poland is 3.6%, while in the UK it was hovering around 0.5%. If this trend continues, Poland will indeed surpass the UK, while Hungary and Romania will do the same by 2040. Unlike Poland, the 2008 financial crisis hit Britain, a finance hub, hard. The government decided to pursue a policy of austerity, fearing debt while not focusing on productivity. Foreign exports declined, as did foreign investment, while wages couldn't keep up with inflation. Productivity hasn't been this low in Britain since the 18th century, and according to most experts, there are no signs of recovery at the moment. Much of the recent concern in Britain came when Labour leader Sir Keir Starmer said, "The British people are falling behind, while our European neighbours get richer, in the East as well as in countries like France and Germany. I'm not comfortable with that. Not comfortable with a trajectory that will soon see Britain overtaken by Poland." He would say that as he wants to blame the people he wants to replace, but he has a point. With a large economy, a military usually follows, which can help seal your standing as a great power, and Poland is no exception. The Polish government said in 2023 that it would raise defense spending from 2.4% of its gross domestic product to 5%. The Polish defense minister Mariusz Błaszczak said Poland is working toward having the most powerful land forces in Europe. Poland already has more tanks and howitzers than its neighbor Germany, and the country says it'll have 300,000 troops by 2035, compared to Germany's current 184,000 and the UK's 231,000. Poland presently has about 152,000 military personnel. Meanwhile, according to the website Global Firepower, while the UK has the fifth most powerful military in the world, how long can it keep investing in its military if its poorest people can no longer afford to live in their houses and buy their groceries? These people may not take kindly to being told their military is expanding as they starve. That's no exaggeration. Reports in 2023 said nearly 1 in 5 low-income families experience food insecurity. 10 million British adults and 4 million children engage in daily intermittent fasting, not because they heard it advertised on a podcast, but because they can't afford to eat. Just recently, Poland inked a deal with South Korea to buy $13.7 billion worth of military equipment, including 82 K2 Black Panther tanks, 200 K9 Thunder howitzers, 48 Fa-50 light attack aircraft, and 218 K239 Chunmoo rocket launchers. Poland also recently bought 250 Abrams tanks from the US and 32 F-35 fighters, all costing around $10 billion. The US also sold $4.75 billion worth of Patriot missiles to Poland, adding to an approved anti-missile defense system. Poland also purchased 18 Advanced Combat High Mobility Artillery Rocket Systems, or HIMARS, for $414 million. For the future, the two nations have agreed to a $10 billion deal, which include 500 HIMARS, 468 launcher-loader module kits, 45 M57 Army Tactical Missile Systems, or ATACMS, and hundreds of guided multiple-launch rockets and warheads. The U.S. said this will improve Poland's military goals of updating capability while further enhancing interoperability with the United States and other allies. With Russia next to Poland, the U.S. is more than happy to support Poland's aspirations of becoming the next big European power. Poland's huge rearmament programs, including a $2.4 billion contract for British CAMS air defense missiles in 2023, tells us Poland means business. The country's defense budget has increased to $30 billion, which at 4.25% of Poland's GDP is the highest proportion of GDP in all NATO nations. Poland is looking to be the kind of military power it was back in its golden age. A military pundit said that no Western country wants to scale up its military so much and so fast. The former NATO spokesman, Jamie Shea, agreed with that, saying Poland will become the strongest military power on land in Central and Eastern Europe. If that's true, with a strong military and a leading GDP, Poland will indeed become a regional great power. The US will also help Poland with its new nuclear energy plan. Another pundit said Poland looks set to become Europe's industrial as well as military powerhouse. Let's face it, Poland knows it must protect itself, given what's happened in the past. As it becomes wealthier and its people become better off, they might not mind such hefty military spending. Considering Poland's recent past, this is quite an economic miracle. The question is, will it last? Even with all of Poland's successes, many Poles don't trust what is reported to be their right-wing nationalist government. Just recently, hundreds of thousands of people marched in the capital Warsaw, saying their government has violated the constitution and is eroding people's fundamental democratic rights. These people like the EU, but they don't like the government, which they fear will turn into another autocracy. Even so, Polish people are flocking back to their homeland. A reverse brain drain is taking place, which has seen them leaving the UK and other countries and returning to Poland, where they say there's more hope for them. They've heard the news about the booming tech industry and the fact that the World Trade Organization said in 2022 that Poland beat countries such as China, India, and Brazil for growth in online services. The Prime Minister Mateusz Morawiecki said not long ago Polish people are starting to realize that there are exciting opportunities waiting for them back home. In January 2022, Poland's finance ministry created the Polish Deal, which lured people back by allowing them to pay zero income tax for the first 4 years after they've resettled. Poland is even attracting US software engineers. One of them said in 2023, people in Poland have more hobbies outside of work, whereas in the UK, work is your life. People like to spend time with their family more in Poland. She said salaries in Poland are now catching up to salaries in the US. Some British firms have now started setting up operations in the EU since after Brexit. They say there are higher costs and numerous new trading rules. It might seem ironic that some British companies are setting up shop in Poland. A writer for an economy-focused website wrote in 2023, Poland is actively courting British firms. But will things stay this way? Will Britain bounce back? Will the phoenix of Poland proceed to the heights of a European superpower? In a decade or so, could Polish people be complaining about all the Brit immigrants trying to enter their country and take their jobs? We can't say for certain this will happen, but as things stand, it's not out of the realm of possibility. Now you need to see how the other half live in Britain, and how the British royals actually make money. Or have a look at how England managed to invade 90% of the world.